Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm the event director at Literati Bookstore. We're pleased to welcome Kate Greene, author of Once Upon a Time I Lived on Mars, in conversation with Jim Ottaviani tonight. Just a reminder of our Zoom etiquette. You heard me as you came in, of course, but you will remain muted throughout the event. And speaker mode is the ideal viewing experience. I will say, but perhaps you'd like to look at the grid. And we just ask that you keep your video off through the remainder of the event. Following the conversation between Kate and Jim, we will have time for a Q&A. The chat is closed to the public, but you can enter questions to me into the chat at any time throughout the event. Only I will see them. I'll also be present in the chat to send links to where you can purchase books as well. And as a reminder, you can purchase Kate's book on our website. Again, I'll include a link to that in the chat. And if you're watching later on YouTube, you can find links in the description below. You can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com, and select titles are also available for curbside pickup if you live in the Southeast Michigan area. In lieu of a book purchase, we'd also ask that you consider a $5 donation to sustain our virtual programming. Whether you'd like to think of that as this week or this month's or this year's subscription, you can make donations at literatibookstore.com/donation. Otherwise, we simply thank you for your attendance this evening or this morning or this afternoon, depending on where in the world you're able to tune in from. So without further ado, Kate Greene was the crew writer and second in command on a simulated Mars mission for the NASA-funded High Seas project. She's a former laser physicist, poet, and essayist whose work has appeared in Wired, The Economist, The Atlantic, The New Yorker, Slate, Discover, Science News, and other publications. She has taught writing at Vanderbilt University, San Francisco State University, and the Tennessee Prison for Women. She currently lives in New York City, where she is a teaching fellow in the writing department at Columbia. She'll be joined by Jim Ottaviani, who's the best-selling author of 14 and counting graphic novels about scientists. His latest, Astronauts, Women and the Final Frontier, illustrated by Maris Wicks, features the first women astronauts. He lives in Michigan and comes to comics via careers in nuclear engineering and librarianship. Please join me in using your Zoom clap reaction functions to welcome Kate Greene and Jim Ottaviani. Take it away.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, thank you, John. Hi, Kate.
Hi, Jim.
It's good to see you from afar.
Yeah, it's good to see you and that beautiful nature in the background. That's pretty nice.
Yeah, I'm pretty lucky. As we were saying just before this started off, most things about the current world situation are awful, but the fact that I'm able to do this in bare feet, with this being a real life backdrop, is okay. What would you have given to have a kind of backdrop like this? And maybe you kind of did have it on the mission. I mean, but you had a very small portal.
Yeah, we just had that one window, and the view out of it was some pretty dry red rocks. So it looked a lot like Mars, and there wasn't any green as far as the eye could see.
So, I mean, now all of a sudden I want to use portal as a metaphor for the book that you've given us. And maybe talk a little bit about, I came to the book not knowing what you were going to try to do with it, whether it was a continuous narrative, whether it would be a bunch of poems that connected to, whether it would be science journalism, which is your background. So many ways to present this story, but you chose essays, which I found really wonderful and quite delightful. And this was a question I was going to save for maybe later, but now that I'm blathering on, one of the things that I noted about the collection of essays was, as I was reading through, and I read through them sequentially, but I suppose you could skip around, but I wouldn't recommend readers do that, because as I was reading through them, I would jot down a question. And then 2 or 3 essays later, you would answer that question. It's almost like you anticipated that readers would want to do this. So I guess I wonder, how do you order a collection of essays like this? Is there an arc to this story? And you can imagine scare quotes around the word arc and story if you want.
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic question, and in some ways pretty complex, and in some ways pretty simple, because I wrote a book proposal and I knew I wanted to have 12 essays, and I had the general topics. So the whole thing is based on this 2013 simulated Mars mission that I did for NASA called High Seas, where I was in a simulation of a Mars mission with 5 other people. And we basically were, not quite astronauts, donating our data to NASA so that eventually that data can go into making some future mission to Mars better. And so during that time, I got to thinking about a lot of different things, and I took some notes, but it's taken me, that was in 2013. So it took me a while to kind of have everything come together. And I was thinking in terms of like general sort of like topics or ideas that I wanted to just like sit with for a while. So for instance, the idea of the standard astronaut, like what is an astronaut's body? Like, why is it problematic in space? What does it look like? And who has chosen that historically and why? So thinking about the standard astronaut, thinking about the reason we were there in the first place was to study us under isolation. So On Isolation is an essay, and On Communication is another essay. We had a 20-minute communication delay, so we were really cut off from Earth. So I had these ideas for a bunch of these essays, and I really just I sat with them for a long time. There's a lot of subterranean work happening, and if they connect, it's because I was sitting with all of the material for all of them for a long time before actually writing them. The actual writing of them, I found that when faced with an essay, I didn't necessarily outline. I wrote down a lot of the things that I had been thinking about. And I kind of checked that list, but I didn't stick to it in all cases. But I found that things were pretty, they moved around a lot. And surprisingly, a lot of the things that I wanted in the entire collection found their way in exactly where they landed. And yeah, it was a pretty fun experience because for me, I'm used to, well, historically I was used to very formulaic writing as a science journalist, and this book was certainly more associative. So I allowed myself the pleasure of sort of witnessing my own consciousness to see where I would move, what concepts would be next to what concepts and memories and emotions and space history, and just let that flow. And that to me was a lot more like how a poem flows for me. You kind of don't know where you're going next, and the poem reveals itself. And so this is a very long answer to your question, but these essays, their structure and the way that they're linked kind of revealed themselves to me as I wrote them in the way that a poem does.
Well, I think that totally comes through in the book because it does have this poetic feel to it. I wonder, well, I've got so many questions about how, say, a writer becomes second in command on a mission like this. It may not be my first choice, but I may just be thinking about myself as whether I should be second in command. But maybe the bigger thing that comes back to the notion that you mentioned about your time as a science journalist and formulaic writing. I'm not sure that's true from what I've read of your science journalism. It doesn't seem so formulaic to me. But for this mission, you were basically, well, is there a better way to put this? Maybe not. You were basically doing a little bit of adult make-believe, you and your crew. And it seems to me that this would be, that your non-science writing would be an advantage to this. Your ability to imagine yourself into new situations and into other people. But you note that it didn't always work that way for you.
Right.
In the book.
Well, it's such a rare, wonderful gift to have NASA our National Space Agency give you permission to pretend to be an astronaut, that was incredible. Like, I couldn't believe my luck, because as a kid, that was my dream, you know, and as I got older, it seemed like that maybe wasn't going to happen. So to have NASA actually say, well, here you go, here's your chance to, as an adult, pretend that you're an astronaut. I mean, how could I not do that? So yeah, I think that was, you know, that was the catalyst, of course. But once you're in there, once you're living in the dome, once you're doing the work, and, you know, it was a lot like grad school. We were conducting experiments, taking data. It was, we had a lot of daily tasks. It was kind of dull, to be honest with you. I think that it was really easy to not really remember that you were on Mars or Earth. You know, you were just staring at your laptop doing the tasks that you needed to do in a lot of ways. It's kind of like living on Earth and just like having things to do on Earth. So yeah, I think that when we would go outside, we would wear these simulated spacesuits, and that was a time when a lot of people on the mission talked about really feeling like they were on Mars. And I mean, I write in the book, I have to admit, I was kind of not all that convinced in those spacesuits either. I was really concerned with like prosaic things. I mean, not so prosaic, but like, honestly, the rocks were super shifty. And if I sprained my ankle, you know, would that end the mission? And so, and it was hard to walk because these suits were bulky and the face plates would fog. And so I was just kind of worried about like the everyday stuff, instead of thinking about, you know, trying to pretend that I was actually on Mars. I was thinking very practical thoughts.
So talking about the spacesuits brings to mind something that you mentioned in the book, where was it you or was it others who had a problem with the aesthetics actually of them? And I'm thinking back to, you know, say a month or so ago when with the SpaceX launch, and I assume you watched that, and those spacesuits look kind of like the spacesuits of our youth in science fiction movies.
Yeah.
How important do you think aesthetics are in these situations?
Oh man, it's such a good question. And I think for better or for worse, they're extremely important, because I mean, these are the images that are supposed to capture the imagination at scale of humanity at scale. So you kind of want this to look as good as possible and as spacey as possible. That said, you have to also recognize that you said the spacesuits of our youth, and that, you know,
well, our youth in fiction.
Yeah, exactly. But then you get to thinking about like who's sort of writing that fiction, you know, like what sort of diversity of ideas did we have there? I mean, not so much. I think that there's such a wider array of aesthetic ideas that we could be experimenting with for space these days. And I really hope that that can become part of the conversation as we go forward. I mean, the SpaceX spacesuits looked good, and I suppose I don't have any specific recommendations, but I think I'm really interested in people thinking differently about what we can do with the way that space looks. Does it have to look so mechanized? Does it have to feel like militarized? You know, if that's its provenance, but like, does it have to do that going forward?
Yeah, well, that moves right into one of the main things that you were doing on your mission, was testing food, the effects of food, and certainly, you know, again, in the real live space missions that we would see, you know, over the past, at least early on in the space program, it was very militarized food, very uninteresting, very mechanized, but for you, you were trying to figure out what made sense and what was important. Can you summarize the findings? You've got like 2 minutes, right, to summarize 4 months of food science.
Well, so yeah, it was, the idea was I was looking at different food systems to see if that could affect people's moods and health. And I actually cannot summarize those findings because they are still being worked on. This, you know, High Seas was a program that lasted for 5 years, and it produced a ton of data. And so people are still churning through that data. And what's really exciting about the project is that because it's a government funded project, that data is going to be available to everyone. So
Yes.
once it is, then you can look at the food data from all these missions and start like asking your own questions and trying to think about food differently for space exploration. But you know, that might be a good segue into reading a section from the book.
Sure. Yeah.
I was
Please.
thinking of reading. So it's the second essay, and it's called Astro Gastronomy. You know, it's about food in space. So
Yes.
I guess I'll just read a few pages from the beginning. Let it begin with poutine. Salty, squeaky, messy, and delicious. Poutine is a French-Canadian delicacy of French fries topped with cheese curds and brown gravy, currently experiencing international acclaim. Likely invented in a restaurant in Quebec in the 1950s, poutine's breakout moment was in 1982 when the Toronto Star introduced it by suggesting two types could be found in the eastern part of the country, regular and Italian style, a version made with spaghetti sauce. Shortly thereafter, its popularity exploded. Before 1982, the use of the word poutine, at least in books digitized by Google, was virtually non-existent. After 1982, the Google graph of its appearance in text shoots straight into the stratosphere. There's a decidedly of the people feel to poutine. Like a sandwich or a casserole, you can make it your own, dress it up or down, add extravagant sauces and toppings such as ground beef, pickles, kimchi, pork, fennel, curried lentils, a fried egg, pepperoni. In 2001, chef Martin Picard elevated poutine by making it with foie gras, now a specialty at his Montreal restaurant Au Pied de Cochon. And in 2007, in a remote outpost on Canada's Devon Island, 10 degrees north of the Arctic Circle and just west of Greenland, across Baffin Bay, poutine went interplanetary. Devon Island is home to the facility used to conduct analog Mars missions. Called Flashline Mars Arctic Research Station, or FMARS, it mainly consists of a two-story metal can that accommodates crews for long expeditions, allowing them to conduct experiments in a harsh, isolated environment. FMARS comes equipped with ATVs for transportation and shotguns to scare off polar bears, which historically hasn't been necessary, but it's good to be prepared. From May to August 2007, FMARS was home to an international crew of 7 people conducting a 4-month mission to better understand potential astronaut challenges on Mars. One of those difficulties turned out to be a homesick Canadian named Simon. To cheer him up, the crew decided to make poutine. While they didn't have French fries or cheese curds, they did have certain dehydrated, shelf-stable, and therefore space-friendly foods, such as packets of brown gravy, a start. The crew improvised the rest. Dehydrated scalloped potatoes stood in for the fries, and powdered milk hinted at the possibility of cheese curds. The curds took some time, I learned from Kim Binstead, crew member on this 2007 FMARS expedition. Kim Binstead is the principal investigator of the High Seas project, and she basically created this Mars on her. Like Simon, Binstead was Canadian and therefore familiar with the restorative powers of poutine. The fries also took some finagling. First, crew members rehydrated the potatoes, then fried them, and finally baked them for good measure. And because we were feeling exuberant, we made alternative sauces, Binstead told me. It took all day, but Simon was extremely happy. We put a Quebec flag next to it and took pictures. The Martian poutine launched dozens of culinary celebrations on Binstead's mission. The crew celebrated birthdays, half birthdays, 3/4 birthdays, any excuse to get creative in the kitchen. All the while, Binstead was reading Ernest Shackleton's diaries from his harrowing 1914 Antarctic journey aboard the Endurance. It was clear that food was important and that Shackleton's crew also had special meals, even if it was just seal fat, she said. I realized food plays an important role in long-duration expeditions, and not just in sustaining yourself, but also helping crews bond and reminding people of home. After the mission, a picture and description of the interplanetary poutine appeared in an academic paper authored by Binstead and others, along with suggestions that meals, in particular celebratory or special meals, might play a crucial role on far-flung space missions. The psychosocial preparation and consumption were very clear. Meals eaten en famille provided the social glue that held the crew together. Mealtimes were an opportunity to discuss the challenges of the day, plan next steps, air complaints, share news, and so on. Special meals were used to break up the monotony of the long mission and to mark the passage of time. Back on Earth, Binstead gave talks about her F-Mars experience. In attendance was Gene Hunter. For years, Hunter had been asking questions about space food, including how fermentation might expand the diversity of flavors, textures, and uses of a limited range of space crops, and how omnivorous astronauts might feel over time about a diet with vegan menu options. Binstead and Hunter decided to partner on a project, a Mars simulation of their own, to test a problem called menu fatigue, which NASA already knew its astronauts encountered on long-duration missions. Simply put, crews on the International Space Station tend to eat less over time. And since a healthy diet is crucial to maintaining bone density and overall health in zero gravity, when calories flag, Houston considers it a problem. I first encountered the concept of menu fatigue when I myself was fatigued one late February day in 2012 scrolling through Twitter. An NPR headline flashed past, "Why Astronauts Crave Tabasco Sauce." Why indeed? I clicked. From the article, I learned it could be that the lack of gravity shifts fluids in astronauts' bodies. Their sinuses clog, their senses of smell dulls, and possibly makes food less palatable. And if so, might it be important to reconsider space menus to make them more appealing? And then at the end of the article, the writer added a suggestion from one Kim Binstead that duck fat be included on a Mars mission instead of margarine. It doesn't weigh anymore, Binstead noted. It's just a shelf stable, and it simply tastes so much better. The article posted a call for volunteer wannabe astronauts. The piece concluded, if the idea of pretending you're on Mars for 4 months is appealing to you, Binstead is still taking applications from people who want to join her simulation. Well, if you're a kind of person, someone who had wanted desperately to go to space camp as a kid, whose parents didn't have the money for it, someone who had geared her whole educational track toward getting the scientific degrees that could qualify her to become an astronaut, but who, along the way, had found herself writing about science rather than doing it, which was fine and even at times quite satisfying, but had no plans to get back into science and no big writing assignments or obligations really on the horizon, who was married but childless, so the possibility of removing herself from the day-to-day would likely not too drastically upend the lives of others, except maybe her wife, her understanding wife. Then especially since being a pretend astronaut matched so closely with her personal hopes and dreams that she years prior gently stashed on the shelf, you might have been inclined to apply. And so I applied. Fantasy is hardly an escape from reality, wrote the children's book author Lloyd Alexander. It's a way of understanding it.
Love that. There's a French connection that I wanted to make here. Proust had Madeleines, right? Mm-hmm. And for you, something really triggered memories during the mission, and it was, what was it? It was Test 9, Sample 15. What smell today would bring you back to the habitat? Or what?
Well, that sample was pineapple, and it was a fresh chunk of pineapple, and that was a very powerful scent because it immediately took me back to the pre-mission parties where we would have barbecues and we were all getting ready. What's funny about that pineapple is it appeared pretty shortly after we started the simulation, so I was kind of like very surprised that suddenly I had this nostalgia for something that was just like a month prior, but it just goes to show how like when you're removed from everything you know, how something not so distant in time can feel like it's so far away. I mean, I feel like a lot of us have that experience.
I was going to say, I think we're this is a very common experience now.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that if I were to smell to this day, if I were to smell some like rehydrated carrots, like the carrot cubes that we rehydrated.
Sounds very appealing.
Yeah, we had a lot of carrots. I think that that would very quickly take me back. There's something a little bit, we ate a lot of vegetables, but they all had the same texture and cut and smell. All the smells sort of blended together when it came to the vegetables in a confusing way. It was a medley. So I think something like sort of generic rehydrating vegetable smell would do it for me.
Okay. On the topic of boredom, I wondered one thing. You had to fill out surveys every day, right?
Yeah.
and I assume some of them were about the food, some of them were about other things that you were doing. I wonder, in a situation where you said it was a lot like grad school, which, repetitive, doing the work, et cetera, did it become more difficult over time to separate yesterday from today from the day before that when you were filling out those surveys?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the same survey questions day in and day out. So
Right.
so you had to really try to, I mean, we wanted to give great data, as good as we could provide. And so you didn't want to just say, yeah, I feel fine, I feel fine. You did truly want to like inwardly look and assess how you were feeling. A lot of it was like, how are your social interactions today? Or were you feeling hungry before you ate? Or do you feel full now? How full? Those sorts of questions. So like it was a real sort of mindfulness exercise to take those survey questions, but there was a loss of texture throughout the mission because there was so much sameness. I was glad that
an analogy to the vegetables, right?
and also an analogy to a lot of isolation that we're experiencing now. On the mission, I started keeping a journal, and I've done that now too, and that's been really helpful to go back and just know that the days actually are different, that things are happening differently day in and day out, and it isn't just the same day.
Were you a journal keeper before?
I wasn't, but I knew I had to, because this was a whole new experience, and I would really be disappointed if I didn't. So I took a lot of notes about the meetings, what people said, and just my own thoughts. And yeah, I did.
How much from that made? Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I did like a little search for the word annoy at a certain point, and to try to figure out like if that ramped up at any point. And it actually started pretty early. There were annoyances pretty early between people who weren't me. I wasn't registering annoyances, but then later in the mission, I started registering my own annoyances. So that was pretty interesting, I thought.
Well, you talked a little bit about micro stimuli in the book, and how these would generate these would be the annoyances, and these are like little things that everybody does. Is it too personal if I ask what folks were like? Kate, could you like not?
Oh, sure.
Sorry.
Well, I know, it's fine. So, I was, it was brought to my attention. People didn't ask me to stop, but it was brought to my attention that on one particular day, I was clearing my throat a lot. And yeah, someone said that, and I was like, no. And then someone else was like, yep. And it was just like this thing. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I really am clearing my throat. And someone said, yeah, you do that a lot, as if like my entire life I've done that. And I was like, I don't think that this is a thing that I normally do. And it turns out that it was just like that day that I was doing it. But for whatever reason, like it felt like I had been doing it the entire mission. You know what I mean? It's just one of those things. Time is super elastic in isolation when there's not a lot else going on.
Yeah. Okay. So so you said you're still keeping a journal now, and
it's not as daily, but yeah, I keep one.
So while you were filling out those surveys and while you were doing this, did the journal help that? And like sub question or parallel question, how much were you able to draw directly from the journal text into this collection of essays? How good are your first drafts, I guess is what I'm asking. So I think that it just, both of those exercises, the surveys and the journal, reminded me of, a certain kind of mindfulness that I should keep during this time, because it was such a strange, unusual experience, and I would have regretted not having the information for myself. And in terms of like what I used in the book, it was kind of fun because I mostly used entries as jumping off points and I found that my journals were not like what I wrote in the journal was, I mean, it's not actually how I write. It was mostly just very, very record keeping, but some of those details allowed memories to sort of unfurl for me. So that's kind of how I use the journal. Yeah. Well, I would have been super impressed if all the literary references and quotes that you season the essays with were like in your journals right at the outset. That would have been.
Oh my gosh. Well, Well, that reminds me of the journals that were used to write about Shackleton's
Yeah, right.
journey.
You brought the Shackleton book with you, did you not?
Yeah, I did. But those guys, I mean, they had such a great literary background. Those explorers, those
Yes.
sailors. Yeah, so they were very learned and and used a lot of quotes, like memorized quotes. It was just sort of beautiful to. I mean, it's true literature what those journals were. So.
So, what
Yeah.
books did you take with you? Because you were
Yeah.
I mean, for a lot of people here at an event like this, it's like 4 months and I get to read a lot in my downtime. This is heaven. So was it heaven?
Yeah, I wanted it to be, but it was really hard for me to get into any books about the first month in. Everything was just so new and so strange that I wasn't able to focus. I brought some novels. I brought some poetry. Can you hear it in the background? There's some noise. And I really wasn't able to settle into that. But one book that I brought that helped kind of like get me into a better frame of mind was the graphic novel "Are You My Mother?"
Yeah, by Alison Picknell.
Yeah, and I think that had something. It had something to do with the fact that there were. I was asked to engage with the text in multiple ways. You know, it wasn't just some linear narrative, and it wasn't just like a poem that I could read and then, you know, get distracted and not go on to the next poem. Because they did bring like Tracy K. Smith's Life on Mars, you know, and I brought, oh God, of course, now I'm blanking on some of the collections. I brought some ebooks too that I read, like Speedboat by Nada Altler and a Mavis Gallant collection, and also Flannery O'Connor. Oh my gosh, Flannery O'Connor, her collection though, that was, I read Everything That Rises Must Converge one night, and I was just really bummed out by that story, and I thought maybe I shouldn't be reading Flannery O'Connor while I'm trapped in a dome with 5 other people. So
didn't Shannon Lucid warn you about this before, or did you talk to her after? Because Shannon Lucid had mentioned that Flannery, well, you mentioned that Shannon Lucid mentions that Flannery O'Connor was a thing she read, but not necessarily a thing she loved while she was on space station.
Well, so I wondered what other astronauts read when they were on their missions, and I did a little bit of research, and I discovered that Shannon Lucid, who spent some time on the Mir space station in the mid-90s, read like 50 books on her mission. She brought like she had boxes of books sent up. And so I asked her, we had a phone conversation. She was delightful, and she told me what she read. And a short story collection of Flannery O'Connor short stories was one of the books that she read. And I asked her what she thought about it. And she just said, she paused for a second and said, it always gave me something to think about the next day. You know, she's very political in her responses. She didn't want to be too judgmental, but I took that to mean that like, those are stories that stick with you. And for me, they stick with me. Flannery O'Connor stories stick with me because they are, they're visceral and can be a little harsh sometimes. There's not a lot of salvation in the Flannery O'Connor.
So what would you recommend to future space explorers?
Oh, I think light fiction. I think some summer peachy reads would be good. Let's see, what else? Yeah, and also graphic novels, because like I was saying, it really is a good mode to get you to think about things differently, having to engage with text and picture, and sort of like doing some story assembly in your head in a way that maybe if you're used to more linear narrative is kind of fun and gets you going in a different way.
Well, that's good to hear. I'm grateful that they're useful as a format. I was a little bit surprised when you mentioned that, but surprised and happy.
Yeah.
Was there any media that you missed while you were away? I have a personal example that's sort of tangential, but in the mid '80s, I went to do a study abroad thing. Well, it wasn't really a study abroad thing, but it was close enough to that we'll call it that, in China. And in the middle of this, it was this is a comics relation. Watchmen, the graphic novel, it started as comic books coming out kind of monthly. and I left for China in the middle of that happening. And getting back to the U.S., I really wanted to know what happened next. What did you want to know what was happening next about? And I guess it doesn't have to be media, but
Oh, wow.
you're really isolated.
Yeah, no, I have to say that Orange is the New Black came out right as the mission started. And I think I'd seen like the first episode, and it was very exciting to me because, I mean, unfortunately, there are some parallels between, and a life in prison, incarcerated, and like living in a dome, not being able to leave. I mean, obviously there are huge differences, but there was something in that first episode where, she was planning to go in and, getting the last things that she wanted to do, her last little bit of freedom out of the way. And I recognize those sort of yearnings to like, get a bunch of stuff done before you go in and you don't know what you won't be able to do or access. So it was strange that happened like right at the beginning of the mission, and then couldn't really proceed with that. So.
Have you caught up since?
Yeah, that was a while ago. Yeah, definitely.
Right. Yeah, that's true. It was a while ago. Yeah. Did you miss your pets? I know you have a pet, and you talked about pets being another one of the test subjects in the book, and you were super unimpressed, if I'm recalling correctly, by the Romibo. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right. I should have looked it up. And the Pleo. So you're a pet person, but were any of your crewmates? And what did others think about?
You know what? I think I might have been the only person with a pet at the time of the mission. And I had my wife at the time, and I had a dachshund and an orange tabby. And so, yes, I missed all three of them quite a lot.
Yes. And the pet substitutes were?
This was a project that our engineer brought to the mission. His question was, you're not going to be able to have animal companions on a mission. What would it be like if you had like a robot companion that could maybe act like an animal if it was cute and fuzzy and like had the same behaviors? Because there's something about like just having a variety of interactions, social interactions. So you're not just only talking to people, that you might have like this little robotic pet. It could relieve stress. It could be a way to just kind of relax at the end of the day. So that was his question. But the robot pets that he brought were a little bit like lo-fi. So I don't think we were very impressed with them. But the concept, I'm very interested in the concept. Yeah, I think it was a good one. Good question.
You've written about AI and even benevolent, I think it was the phrase you used, benevolent deception in this. And I wondered if those sorts of things, when applied to a robotic pet, would that have made it better in your opinion? You know more about this than I do.
Yeah, well, benevolent deception in like user interface design, it's something that's pretty interesting to me, like how all user interfaces have some kind of deception built in. So, we're using, we can't see the guts of this, the camera and the entire process that's behind this interaction. And that's a good thing. But there's some question about whether or not, like a progress bar, like if something is uploading or downloading is a version of this deception. Is it because it's not necessarily representing the true length of time? And so, I actually do think that a Mars mission could benefit from some deftly applied benevolent deception in some of the technologies. I think that I think, you have to ask a lot of ethical questions and maybe even confer with the people who are using the technology. But if there's a way to lessen the burden of that isolation through technologies that sort of like gently fudge the truth, nothing big, but something that just doesn't, is a little bit gentler. I mean, if you just think about the way that human beings are with each other, there are always like conversation, just like little ways that things are omitted, or, I wouldn't even say white lies, but just we aren't speaking the whole truth, but technology tends to speak the whole truth. And maybe the whole truth all the time isn't what people who are hundreds and hundreds of millions of miles away from Earth need to hear,
Mhm.
you know? But of course, I think that, you know, that's a great question. And now you've got me talking off the cuff, so I don't know if I can go much further with that. But
Well, let's bring it back to writing then. So what kind of writer would you want to be crafting these things? And would these be in the form of story, in the form of poetry?
Are you asking what sort of writer should be on a Mars mission?
That, and maybe even doing some of these design things, because we talked about aesthetics.
Oh, I see.
Aesthetics of missions.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that you were there on purpose,
Mm-hmm.
and that I would imagine that NASA is going to say, you know, there's value to having someone who can express things in a different way rather than, how are things today? Nominal. You know.
I think that that's interesting. So like a writer crafting or helping to develop the technological interfaces for communication. I think that's a super valid suggestion, because there are writers that are working today for Amazon, for instance, who are writing responses for Alexa to give to people, you know, and understanding the you know, how you deliver certain information and what sort of questions that you're going to get, you know, anticipating a huge range of questions and then giving some creative answers to the more unusual ones. So writers definitely have jobs like that these days. I would love it if a poet was on a Mars mission, because I think that you could get a lot of very strange language coming out of that experience from someone who is practiced in making language strange. I think that would be a pretty fun thing. So, yeah.
Would you want to be that poet?
I don't know. I think I would like to punt on that one, and maybe I think that there could be other poets who might do a very good job of that. Yeah.
Okay. I think we're at the Q&A time. Yep, there's John breaking in right now. John, you're muted.
Sorry, I was clicking it multiple times. I blame Zoom UI. We do have a question. I encourage people to send more questions as well if they have any. The first question is, based on your mission experience, what are a couple of things you expect to be the biggest challenges for astronauts on a Mars mission?
That's yeah, I mean, I think that the way that NASA selects astronauts, or is talking about selecting astronauts for these long duration missions, is that they have a thick skin, a long fuse, and an optimistic outlook. But even with all of that, it's really difficult to not feel annoyed with other people in small spaces under isolated conditions for a long period of time. And you can think that you're not annoyed, but there's a tension that builds up. And so I think that maybe ways to assess that more honestly, there's a culture at NASA that you know, you don't want to complain if you're an astronaut. You don't want to say you're bored. You don't want to say things are bothering you, because if you say that, then you won't be invited back, or, you know, you're not astronaut quality material if you're feeling bad about something. So I think that it would be really beneficial to acknowledge that astronauts are not actually robots, and that that it is important to acknowledge, no, you are a very good human being an astronaut, but we also acknowledge that these are human challenges, and we can kind of talk about them so that they don't become really big challenges. Because Kim Binstead, the head of the mission, has said that if something goes wrong with the social part of a mission to Mars, it could be as disastrous as if a rocket explodes. So those are just, yeah, I think that there needs to be more honesty in the human challenges that people face, even if they are astronauts.
You wrote an article a while back about all-female missions to Mars, and you quoted one of South Korea's astronauts talking about diversity. And it seems to me that would be extremely important in the sense that, you know, again, in early days of the space program, the astronaut corps looked, I mean, literally looked, sounded, and what was alike. But when you're talking about these long duration missions, like the one that you simulated, one of the things that annoys people the most are things that they don't like in themselves and their own traits. So it would seem to me that having a diversity of outlooks, viewpoints, backgrounds, expertise, all these things would really aid in diminishing that, because you're less likely to, you know, the thing that I hate most about myself as a test pilot is trait X. But test pilots often have that trait because that's what made them test pilots. Whereas,
that's a great point. Yeah, I think a diverse crew could also, you know, I did mention it in the book. We had a fair amount of diversity on our crew, and at times it made communication a little bit more difficult. There were some language barriers, but it also like made us more aware of each other in a way that we wouldn't have been otherwise. So you didn't automatically have the shorthands. So you actually had to like make sure you understood what was going on. And I think that there's some advantages there to keeping your brain nimble. You know, you don't get as bored as quickly of like social interactions, like it's an unexpected social interaction, for instance. So I think that, I think diversity has all sorts of things going for it.
Yeah.
I have a question. Actually, hearing Kate, you talk about, and Jim ask questions about sort of crew dynamics, it makes me think about the degree to which crew dynamics are a focus of popular media about space travel and long duration space travel. And even in books like Andy Weir's The Martian and the film adaptation, there's not a crew per se because he's alone, but there's a lot of focus on his being exactly as you described, like very optimistic, long fuse, like almost to the point where when I was watching that movie, I was like, this guy doesn't seem like a human being because he's super plucky about everything that's happening. But it makes me think about like even outlandish sci-fi, like the Area X trilogy is a lot about crew dynamics. One of the big quarantine watches, I think, has been the documentary about Biosphere 2, which definitely had a bit of a different ideology than a NASA project. But I'm wondering what you think. You're both a writer and someone who's been in one of these situations. So I'm wondering if you could speak to, or what you think of sort of popular conceptions of crew dynamics. As you mentioned, something that NASA obviously thinks is super important enough to jeopardize a mission, and your experience of those crew dynamics and where they sort of converge and diverge.
Well, I think that what we have coming from NASA is kind of like a test pilot mentality still that permeates that culture, and what we have from popular media often is like geared toward drama. So you're going to have people who maybe are hotheads or something like that, and that's really good for a film, but it's probably not the best thing for a Mars mission. And when you think about test pilots, there tend to be pretty big egos involved with that, and so you want to like minimize the drama. I mean, unfortunately, I think that the most boring people in the world should be selected for these first Mars missions, because you absolutely don't want drama, like on the one hand. But on the other hand, I think that if you have people going to another planet, you would want people to actually have a range of personalities and experiences and impulses. And so I have to say, I don't know what the answer is to that. You know, I would love it if artists were on a Mars mission, or people who were very artistically driven. But I think that it depends on the artist, you know, like, are they low drama? You know, is this test pilot low drama? Is that the best? I just have to say, I don't actually know the answer to that.
Well, it's a question I think from our guests that kind of ties into that a little bit. What potential is there for having positive experiences that aren't possible on Earth? what kind of positive personal experiences do you think are likely? And I guess my question is, like, if there's personalities that can't capture that, then I don't know. I would like there to be a poet on Mars to write back about what it's like.
Well, what I think is really interesting about the Apollo astronauts, for instance, actually even the Gemini and Mercury astronauts, like the experience of space itself was so awe-inspiring that a good number of them broke protocol and did things that wasn't in the flight plan at all. And they were obeying a very human impulse. So for instance, the Earthrise photo was taken, there were supposed to be no pictures of Earth on that mission. It was, the camera was for the moon, you know, to collect scientific data about the moon. But they looked back and saw what the Earth looked like hanging there in blackness, in that void, and they couldn't not take that picture, you know? So there's something about the experience that that I think will stir almost anyone to create something, to do something with it. So, I mean, I go back and forth on this. I think, yeah, send an artist, but I also think that it's so interesting to see what comes from people who are so overpowered by the like literal awe of the experience that they must absolutely must create from that.
Thank you. And I think we'll end with a standard book selling question, and this is for both Kate and Jim, which is, what are you reading right now? What recommendations would you make to our viewers out there?
That's great. Jim?
The book I am 2/3 of the way through right now is Tana French's first novel, Into the Woods. It's infuriating me because apparently this is the first thing she ever wrote, and it's so good that I can't believe that it's her first book. What else is on the docket right now? I've got Terry Gamble's The Eulogist waiting, and I think I'm rereading, because it's been so long, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy by John le Carré. I think I'm going to read a bunch of John le Carré. He's also very good. It's very much to Kate's experience. It's been hard to concentrate on super serious, you know, good for me, is there such a thing, books for the past couple months. But fortunately, well, I think maybe Once Upon a Time I Lived on Mars is good for me. So, okay. I mean, if you want to talk about the last book I finished, it's Kate's.
Oh, thank you, Jim. That's nice. Yeah, I've been kind of scattershot with my reading, but I've been really enjoying the biography of the poet Robert Duncan by Lisa Jarnow. And Duncan was a poet in the Berkeley Renaissance in the 50s and 60s, and yeah, his life is interesting. He's a really smart guy, strange guy, but it's a great book to read, to think about the Bay Area during that time and that whole poetry scene. So I've been enjoying that, and just like a smattering of poems and you know, the Twitter scroll and people's captions and their Instagrams. So yeah, that's what I've been reading.
I think that's what we all have the capacity for, or the attention span for these days. But we do encourage you to buy Once Upon a Time I Lived on Mars, which you can do at our website and in the description if you're watching on YouTube, as well as Jim Ottaviani's Astronauts, which is available for curbside pickup if you live in Ann Arbor. And thousands of more books are available at our website as well. Kate and Jim, thank you so much for such a lovely conversation this evening.
Thank you, John. This is great. Thank you so much, Jim. I loved it.
You're welcome, both of you, and thank you for inviting me. I had a great time.
Thank you, and hopefully we'll see you in the store in Ann Arbor sometime soon. But until then, continue to stay safe and stay healthy. And thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll see you at the next event.
Yeah, do the curbside pickup. You feel like a secret agent.
That's right.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks everyone. Take care.
Bye all.